Chapter 59. Abuses of Law. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 11 to 14. But if any man hate his neighbour, and lie in wait for him, and rise up against him, and smite him mortally that he die, and fleeth into one of these cities, then the elders of a city shall send and fetch him thence, and deliver him into the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Thine eye shall not pity him, but thou shalt put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, that it may go well with thee. Thou shalt not remove thy neighbour's landmarks, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 11 to 14. The subject of these verses is the abuse of law. The cities of refuge were established in order to give men a recourse from legal tyrannies. Men are all too prone to abuse laws by using them to evade justice, or in other cases, to use the law to establish lawlessness and tyranny. Sinful men do not want justice, and, as a result, they will use the best of laws for evil purposes. The cities of refuge represent a strong concern for justice. Their purpose was to avoid feuds and injustices by establishing a means whereby a man could get a godly court to hear his case. Verses 11 and 12 deal with cases of men who kill and then pretend that the killing was an accidental one. Men still go to great lengths to stage murders as accidental deaths. In so doing, they commit two crimes. First, they commit murder, and the penalty for this is death. This is a very ancient penalty. God ordered this punishment for murder at least as far back as Noah. Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. Although we see the existence of a death penalty as far back as Eden. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. Then, second, the man who abused the legal system in an attempt to evade the penalty for his crime was also striking out at law. He was, in effect, trying to mollify or kill the law. His resort to the cities of refuge was an abuse of the law, a very serious abuse. The penalty for this was a grim one. The city elders, or aldermen, had the duty of sending for him. They would provide the evidences of wilful murder, and, after a trial, the guilty man would be handed over to the city elders. They, in turn, handed him over to the kinsman, or avenger, who prosecuted the case to see to the execution. Thus, all attempts to use the law for lawless purposes are here condemned. This is especially pertinent to our time because technicalities of a trifling nature are routinely used to abuse justice. With many lawyers, but by no means all, the abuse of the law is a way of life. But this law makes it clear that God regards it as injustice for men and societies to abuse the law, whether it be criminal, corporate, welfare, or any other sphere of law. To abuse the law is to practice a most flagrant injustice. Verse 13 forbids pity to those who abuse the law. We are also told that it will not go well for a people who permit these abuses of the law. The abuse of this law of the cities of refuge is called in Numbers chapter 35, verse 34, a defiling of the land. It is, in particular, a great pollution because God declares that He dwells in the land which is covenanted to Him. He dwells among His people, so that the abuse of law is not only a pollution of the land, but an offence against God. This means that God takes vengeance in His time on all such pollution, and who can escape God? Verse 14 forbids, quote, removing, end quote, landmarks or falsifying boundary lines. Stones in antiquity marked the boundaries of fields, and these were easily moved. In our time, for certain types of properties, fences mark property lines. Violations of this law still exist. Some years ago, a man who surveyed rural properties told me that such offences were not uncommon. At times, a ranch surveyor did his work in a bar, sitting with the owner and setting boundaries at his instruction. At other times, in refencing an area, a fence would be moved a foot to the fencer's advantage, adding some acres to his range. This would be done when the rains came, so that traces of the shift would be obliterated. Such a theft constitutes not only 1. Stealing, but is also 2. A form of perjury. In antiquity, some peoples considered it 3. A form of murder because it struck at the life and livelihood of another man. According to Kyle and Delitzsch, landmarks were regarded as sacred among other nations also. By the Romans, for example, they were held to be so sacred that whoever removed them was to be put to death. The simple fact is that in our time properties are not often surveyed. This means that falsifications often continue for generations before they are caught. There is a long history of such stealing that goes unreported, but is known by oral report. There are references to this law both in Proverbs and in Hosea. Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 28. The princes of Judah were like them that remove the bound. Therefore I will pour out my wrath upon them like water. Hosea chapter 5, verse 10. In both instances, we see a broader application of this law. As case law, it is applied generally to mean any and every breach of God's law. When men and nations, rulers and peoples alter God's law, or by reinterpretation, weaken or alter its meaning, they have then falsified God's boundaries. They have made his righteous law into an instrument of injustice. Certainly this judgment applies especially to churchmen who, by their antinomianism, dispose of God's landmarks, his law. God's law establishes boundaries which men and nations are not to transgress. Serious as it is to rob a neighbour by falsifying the boundary lines, it is far more serious to set aside or falsify God's law. But this is precisely what both church and state, as well as school, are now busily doing. God's landmarks are being triumphantly set aside as a sign of great enlightenment. By removing God's landmarks, men plan to initiate a golden age of freedom, but as it approaches, the golden age looks more and more like the fires of hell. Ancient Rome and other countries required the death penalty for all falsifications of boundary lines. Very obviously, God's law regards this as a more serious offence than did Rome, but it prescribes no penalty by man. This is a very important fact and is basic to God's law. When the destruction of land boundaries and moral landmarks becomes a part of the lives of a people, then no human agency can cope with the problem because it is a part of the problem. God thus reserves judgment for violations of this law to himself. This offence is also an abuse of law. Few things are more commonplace in our time than this, the use of the law or law system to advance evil and to subvert good. Hosea makes it very clear what removing landmarks means, and yet there is no preaching on these texts. Pupils all over the world must call attention to these texts, lest they too are judged as faithless men by the Almighty. Politics and churchmanship today are extensively concerned with overlooking this evil. We must echo the words of Psalm 119, verse 126. It is time for thee, Lord, to work. for they have made void thy law.